ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 12th Z Jaipur Literature Festival. We are here at the Bar Hall. Please welcome Daniel Lieberman in conversation with Tony Joseph, the story of the human body, how we evolved. They'll be signing their books after the session by the book signing area on your left of the bar hall. So get your copies and they'll both be there.
Good morning, everyone. Yesterday, before the sun rose, while most of us were still in our beds, Professor Daniel Lieberman was running a half marathon through the streets of Jaipur, along with 30 other members of the Jaipur Running Club, some of whom are here today, I gather, who had somehow got wind of his presence in the city. That is because he is one of the few who do practice what they preach. As professor of evolutionary biology at Harvard University, and as the author of the remarkable book, The Story of the Human Body, he often argues that our bodies are underutilized, underused, and that this may be the underlying cause of many of our present-day health problems, from diabetes to obesity to flat-footedness. One of his main suggestions, therefore, is for us to be more physically active. We are also now going to run with him, more in an intellectual sense than in a physical sense, to try and catch up on the latest understandings about the human body and what they can tell us about how to lead a healthy life. The beauty of Daniel's book is that it avoids the easy, hasty oversimplifications that we often come across when we speak about health and the human body. It's now common wisdom that the human body is adapted for a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and therefore that we need to probably go back to it. But is there one hunter-gatherer lifestyle or many? And how our body has been modified by the agricultural and industrial revolutions, and if yes, to what extent? There was a time when our ancestors, millions of years ago, lived only on fruit. Then they diversified their diet to include various vegetables, roots, animal meats, etc. Then their bodies and minds evolved further as they learned how to cook so as to be able to consume food by spending far less energy. One of the sharp insights that Professor Lieberman has provided in his book is that while the human lifespan is much longer now than what it used to be, we have also become far more prone to chronic diseases caused by the mismatch between how we live our everyday lives and how our bodies are structured. There are no real medicines to cure what Lieberman calls mismatched diseases. You will hear more about this. The only sustainable solution is to change the lifestyle that is causing these diseases. But before we talk about this, we need to hear the story of Dan Lieberman himself, how he came to focus on mismatched diseases and what the state-of-the-art suggestions for managing or reducing their impacts are. After the presentation, which is Daniel will be answering our questions. So as you listen to the presentation, please note down the questions that you may want to ask so as to make it more efficient, the use of our use of the time available. So, Dan?
Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I don't think I've ever given a lecture in such a beautifully painted room. And I have to say, it's also I really love the energy at this festival. And one of the things I've noticed is no offense to the older folks like me, but how many young people there are at this festival. I think that really bodes well. So just hats off to the literary festival. This is a really remarkable achievement. So I thought I'd sort of try to introduce the book by trying to explain why I wrote it at first. And let's see if this clicker works. So, oh, wow, it does. Okay. So most of my life, I spent much of my life interested in trying to tell the basic story of how the human body evolved. And I really started off as a head guy. You know, in my field, people either study bodies below the neck or bodies above the neck. And I was an above the neck guy. I studied heads, and I traveled to Africa, and I dug up fossils, and I just was deeply interested in trying to figure out that tree that you see on the right of the slide there. You know, who begat whom, and what happened in human evolution. And it's great fun because I'm by nature a jack of all trades, and I have a lab in my department where I do experimental biology. I stick people on treadmills and stick needles in them and take various fluids from their bodies, and I also go out into the field and study what people do with their bodies. I do most of my work in East Africa, but I also work in Mexico, and then finally I get to study old fossils, and so it's great fun. There's no way you can't have fun doing what I do. And for years and years and years, I spent, in addition to writing scientific papers, I worked on this academic book called The Evolution of the Human Head. I spent more time than actually I'm admitting on the slide working on this book. And as I was working on the book, I went through a kind of a midlife crisis because, you know, you spend years and years and years working on an academic book and you realize maybe 600 people will read it. And what the hell am I doing spending that much time on something that only a few other, you know, boring academics are actually going to want to read? And furthermore, you know, the world is full of problems. We have global climate change. We have an obesity epidemic. We have poverty and disease. And who gives a, you know, hoot about heads, right? It's not really all that important. So while I was sort of spending years and years and years working on this book that nobody would care about, that had no relevance to the world, at the same time, I was also working on the evolution of running. So we published a paper, my colleague Dennis Bramble and I published a paper in 2004 that was on the cover of Nature entitled Born to Run, in which we made the argument that humans evolved to run long distances. And to my astonishment, the paper kind of went viral. We had, you know, thousands of newspaper articles written about it, and that led to my own renaissance in running, and I started running long distances. And then a few years later, we published another paper in Nature on barefoot running, which, if any of you heard about the barefoot running craze, I'm sorry, it's my fault. But there were so many people interested in that, and so there I was working on this boring book on the head, and meanwhile, all kinds of people are interested in the other kind of part of my research, which is on running. And I realized that I don't have that many years left in my life, and I wanted to work on a book that was of relevance to people rather than just, you know, boring academics. And so I started this new book, and the working title on my laptop was, actually I can't say it in public, so I'm gonna bowdlerize it slightly, but the title of the file was "Why Should Anybody Give a Bleep About Human Evolution?" I'm not making that up. And the basic core question I was interested in is how can an evolutionary history of the body help us understand disease and illness and injury? And the basic argument I wanted to make is that we did not evolve to be healthy, right? We evolved to have as many offspring as possible in challenging circumstances, and we only evolved to be healthy in as much as health promotes reproductive success. It's not a very complicated argument, but it's something that people don't think about a lot. And so the book has three portions. One part is you know, how the body evolved to be the way it is. That's the story, really. That's the first story. But then there's a second story, which is what's happened since our species evolved, and then finally, how is that relevant to our lives today? So very quickly, I'm going to go through 7 million years of history in one slide. So we evolved from a very chimpanzee-like creature. We initially became bipeds, and then we started moving to open habitats, and we started hunting and gathering, and we started getting more energy and getting big brains, and bam, we evolved, right? So that's 7 million years of human evolution. And thanks to that sort of long 7 million year complicated story, which you can read about in slightly more detail in the book, we evolved to be bipedal creatures with really big brains. We're really fat. The average, even a skinny human being, has about 15 to 20% body fat, whereas a typical primate is maybe 3 or 5% body fat. Even the skinny ones amongst us are very fat creatures compared to most other mammals. We're furless, and we're sweaty, and we're tool dependent. We take a long time to grow. We evolved to eat a high fiber diet and a low carb diet, but we love sugar and starch and low fiber foods and high sugary foods. We evolved to be extremely physically active, but we also love to spend as much time not being physically active. So that's basically what we evolved to be. But of course, we didn't stop evolving 250,000 years ago. Our bodies have kept changing, right? And part of that change is natural selection, right? The ingredients of natural selection are variation. Everybody in this room looks different from each other. Some of that variation is heritable because of the genes that we inherited. And we have variation in reproductive success. Some of you have 1 child, and some of you have 3 children, some have 5 children, some no children, right? And any heritable variation that affects your reproductive success gets differentially transmitted to the next generation. That's natural selection, still going on. But there's an even more powerful force that's going on today, and that's cultural evolution. Just think about it. Just a few thousand years ago, the first people started, scribbling stuff on clay tablets, and now we all carry computers in our pockets, right? And there's almost near universal literacy in many countries. I mean, this is a blink of an eye in evolutionary time, and so these learned behaviors are a far more powerful and recent force. And the really 2 big ones are the agricultural revolution, which started only about 600 generations ago, right? Our ancestors have been farming for just 600 generations. That's not much time. And then the last few generations, we've become industrialists and now post-industrialists, right? And so we now have more food, we have more people, we also have more infectious disease because of the agricultural revolution. And because of the industrial revolution, where we've mechanized labor, we now have incredible amounts more energy, which gives us more food and more people. And also we've made advances in medical science and sanitation, et cetera, which has really brought down the death rate, so lots of people. So a lot of people wail and say, like, the agricultural revolution was the biggest mistake that happened in the human evolution. The industrial revolution has been all bad, but that's not really true. It's a more complicated story because by any measure, today is the healthiest era in human history. I'd rather be born today than at any other time in terms of the health of my body. Here's just a little bit of data. Infant mortality, for example, has been very high historically until just very recently, but now, most of us expect our children to survive and reproduce. That's a bizarre thing in evolution, right? Hunter-gatherers, if they survive childhood, live to be pretty old, but today, in many developed countries, people expect to be in their 70s or 80s. There are now billions of us, and we're tall, which is a good marker of health. So we're doing really well. But there's other things that are going on, and something that we all need to pay attention to is what's graphed here. It's the epidemiological transition. So over the last few generations, there's been incredible, because of inventions in sanitation and medicine, an incredible decrease in infectious disease and malnutrition. I mean, how many of you in this room are worried about dying of smallpox? Right. But how many of you in this room are worried about dying of heart disease or cancer? You should all raise your hands, right? So these are diseases that are spreading rapidly, right, around the world. In India, for example, this is a slightly troubling slide, but this is happening around the world. In India, there's been a doubling. So this is a heat map of percentage of individuals who are overweight in India. Since 1990, that percentage has doubled in India, and 38% of those individuals have type 2 diabetes. And they're at greater risk of cancer and heart disease and all kinds of other problems, right? So, and we have other diseases that didn't used to occur in much frequency, like myopia and cavities, which are not so serious, right? You go to a dentist or an ophthalmologist. Lower back pain, which is a bit more serious. Flat feet, Alzheimer's, depression, anxiety. I could go on and on and on and on. In fact, and what's really going on is that although people are living longer, ET, by the way, means epidemiological transition here. So before the epidemiological transition, people weren't living as long, but they weren't sick very much before they died, right? We call that morbidity. But today we're living longer, but the amount of time we spend sick and spending healthcare dollars has increased vastly. We call this the extension of morbidity. And this is what's driving up healthcare costs around the planet, or one of the reasons. Now, a lot of people think, this is great, right? I have the privilege of dying in my 70s from heart disease because I didn't die young from smallpox, right? We think this is the price of progress. But I would disagree with that because we are confusing diseases that occur in old age with the diseases that are actually caused by old age. That's not the same thing. And in fact, most of these diseases are not caused by aging. They simply become more common as we age. They are not a necessary consequence of the epidemiological transition. And so the final component of this book is really, I try to ask myself, how is the human body's evolution relevant to this epidemiological transition, and how can we think differently? And the core argument of the book, really, is that a lot of the diseases that we're getting are what I call a mismatch disease. A mismatch disease is a disease that's more common or more prevalent or more severe because our bodies are inadequately or imperfectly adapted to the modern environmental conditions in which we now live, right? And here's, don't read the list, but here's just, it's just to scare you, basically. But this is a long list of diseases that we think are mismatch diseases for which we have a fair amount of evidence. And I've left out infectious diseases completely, and there are a lot of mismatch infectious diseases. And if you think like, oh, well, I'm not going to really deal with those diseases, almost all of us in this room are actually likely to die from mismatch diseases. The two major causes of death in the developed world are cancer and heart disease. That kills 2 out of 3 people. And those are basically mismatched diseases. So we really should be paying attention to these, right? So let me give you an example of one kind of mismatched disease. And the book really divides them up, and I talk about diseases of too little, diseases of too much, and diseases of too new, stimuli that are too little, too much, and too new. And let's talk about one that's, I think, very relevant to this subcontinent, which is type 2 diabetes, rapidly growing disease here. And this story really starts about 2 million years ago. This is a graph of brain size over the last few million years. And around 2 million years ago, you see that graph takes an upward sweep, right? That's when our brains started getting bigger. Now, brains are expensive. As you're sitting here listening to me, or maybe not listening to me, out of every 5 breaths, just one of your breaths is paying for your brain. Your brain takes up 20% of your body's energy, even when you're asleep, right? It's a very expensive organ. And so in order to grow bigger brains, we needed more energy. Our bodies also started getting bigger around 2 million years ago. We became gas guzzlers of the animal world around 2 million years ago, right? And we also changed our life history, right? Chimpanzees have offspring every 6 years, but we managed to start doubling our rate of having offspring, and this is hunter-gatherers, to every 3 years. Farmers can pump them out every year or so, right? And we also changed the rate at which we grow. So here's the future king of England, maybe 2 future kings of England, right? And the younger one didn't reach reproductive maturity until he was 18, which is really slow. A chimpanzee is a fully grown, sexually mature adult at the age of 12, right? So we've slowed down our growth rate by 50% just compared to chimpanzees, which already have slow growth rates. That's a lot of extra energy, right? So we spend a lot of energy growing. And how did we get that energy? Through this brilliant system that we evolved 2 million years ago called hunting and gathering. And it's a complicated system. It involves making tools, it involves hunting, it involves extractive foraging, and it involves division of labor and cooperation, all kinds of really great stuff. And basically, what it's all about is getting lots of high energy foods. We cook our foods, we get high quality foods, we get meat, we get honey, we get all kinds of good stuff that helps fuel this energetically intensive system. And we transformed that, again, starting around 600 generations ago with the agricultural revolution, where we figured out how to get even more of this stuff. And with the industrial revolution, we can now turn corn into sugar, and we can grow animals as if they're plants. I mean, it's amazing how we've managed to do this, right? So here's an example. A hunter-gatherer might get about 4 to 8 pounds of sugar a year, primarily in the form of honey. But today, the average American, I don't know what it is in India, the average American consumes 100 pounds of sugar a year, which is, you can see if you've ever visited America, right? And our fiber content, right? The average hunter-gatherer eats 80 pounds a year of fiber, and the average American who's, suffering from this problem, right, eats only about 12 pounds of fiber a year. That's what actually the US RDA is, right? So many people are getting less than that, right? And this is really dangerous because sugar, there are 2 major kinds of molecules that make up sugar, glucose and fructose. Glucose is the kind of starchy one, and fructose is the kind of sweet one. Well, when you eat a lot of sugar, in the absence of fiber, your insulin levels shoot up. That's what that graph shows you. And we call this a high glycemic food, and that's a real burden on your insulin system. If you eat a lot of fructose, that goes straight to your liver, and your liver never evolved to deal with all that much fructose, especially in the absence of fiber, and your liver turns into fat, and you get what's called non-alcoholic fatty acid liver disease, which is as bad as it sounds, and afflicts 1/3 of Americans, by the way, and probably a lot of people here on this in this country. And this leads to metabolic syndrome. It leads to insulin. If you have a big belly, watch it, right? That belly is a sign of a lot of visceral fat. That's a sign of metabolic syndrome that's either happened or on its way, because it's very dangerous fat reserves, and it leads to a whole variety of problems. An example is, again, type 2 diabetes. So like all diseases, it's a disease that's an interaction between our genes and our environment. I'm sorry, I'm not going to talk about genes today, but they're a very important part of the story. And that leads to insulin resistance. So the insulin receptors on our muscle and fat cells cease to function. But those insulin receptors are necessary for sugar to get into those cells. So the sugar is trapped in the bloodstream from insulin resistance. That leads to high blood sugar. Our pancreases then respond to that because blood sugar is toxic. Too much sugar is bad for us in all kinds of ways. So our pancreas starts to pump out insulin, but the insulin is silent because the receptors are blocked. And so you get this vicious circle, which ends up leading to type 2 diabetes and a variety of health problems and eventually to death. But that's just one of a lot of scary diseases. We have heart disease and breast cancer and fatty liver syndrome and Alzheimer's and osteoporosis and blah, 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 blah. I'm sorry, it's a very depressing book in some regards. But I'd like to end on a positive note, which is, can we do something? And the medical world is struggling to deal with these problems. And one of the arguments I make in this book is that we're not going to solve this problem without an evolutionary way of thinking, right? Because the human body wasn't designed, it wasn't engineered, it evolved. And if you want to understand why the human body is the way it is, you have to understand our problems, we need to understand that why part of the story. That's the evolutionary story. And I believe that we've created a new evolutionary dynamic, which I call dis-evolution. Dis for being bad, and evolution for change over time. But it's not a biological, it's not natural selection. This is cultural evolution. And it's a kind of a feedback cycle. So we get sick from, say, diabetes because we drink too much Coca-Cola or have too much, white rice or whatever and not physically active. We get overweight and obese and insulin resistant. We get diabetes. We go to our doctor. Doctor gives us metformin or insulin injections. And that enables us to continue the lifestyle, the stimuli that gives us the disease in the first place, which is why the disease is getting more and more common and why it's afflicting people at earlier and younger ages. We've created a positive feedback loop because we're treating the symptoms of the disease, not addressing the root causes. And that's an evolutionary dynamic that's going on in many, many, many domains. And the problem is that we can't just tell people not to eat sugar, because we never evolved to make the choices that we're asking people to make, right? We evolved to crave sugar. The favorite food, if you're hunter-gatherer in Africa, your favorite food is honey. I've gone hunting with hunter-gatherers, and we didn't hunt most of the time. We go out and get honey from various beehives. They love sugar just as much as we do, right? They just don't have access to it, and you have to get stung by bees in order to get it, right? So, we have this mismatch between our proclivities and our desires and our tastes and our modern environment. And we're not going to be able to change and of course all these diseases are gene-environment interactions. We're not going to be able to change our genes, and most of the genes that are relevant to these diseases are rare genes of small effect. So there are no big gun genes out there available to target for diabetes. But what we can change is our environments. We know how to do this, right? But it's a political problem, right? Because we have to decide what we're going to do. For example, going back to sugar, what are we going to do about the fact that sugar is so cheap and available? And really, we have two alternatives. One is that we can coerce ourselves. We can ban things, right? We've done this with trans fats, which are a form of poison. And maybe we should ban advertisements for sugary foods for children and things like that. But the other thing we can do, of course, is to inform each other and nudge each other and help each other make the decisions that we want to make. And that involves things like soda taxes and other ways to non-coercively help us change our behaviors for the better. But the important point, and this is what I want to end on, is that we're not going to be able to do this, we're not going to be able to think our way through this without including, not exclusively, but including an evolutionary perspective. Because we need to address those why questions. Why is the human body the way it is? Why do we get sick? And how can we use that kind of information to help us do better? So that's what the book is about. I hope you get a chance to read it, and I'd be happy to sign it, etc. And I'd be happy to talk some questions.
That's a really scary list of diseases that you put out there. But in old age, if those diseases don't get you, something else will get you in any case, right? So why should you care?
Well, because I'd like to live a long and happy life in which I stay vigorous and then die fast, right? I mean, yes, everybody has to die, but you know, and we have lots of data on this, but people used to be vigorous and physically active throughout middle age. You know, retirement is a modern idea, right? Hunter-gatherers are actually more active when they're in middle age or grandparents than their children, and they stay, and these physical activity actually induces repair mechanisms, induces maintenance mechanisms that keeps our body healthy and vigorous and active. And so when they do get sick in old age, it's usually infectious disease like pneumonia or something like that, and we all, our time will come, but I would rather have my time come in my 80s or 90s and not be feeble and spend millions and millions of dollars of healthcare beforehand.
What's the human body as it is engineered to eat? You know, there has been a lot of fads, paleo diets and things like that. So what are we designed to eat?
It's easier to say what we're not designed to eat or evolved to eat. I mean, you know, there is no paleo diet, right? If you go to one hunter-gatherer group or another hunter-gatherer group, some are eating more meat and some are eating more fish and some are eating, you know, insects and some are eating, you know, whatever. There are many different kinds of hunter-gatherer diets. But in general, they're diverse. They're very rarely dependent on just a few species. They tend to have low levels of saturated fat. It's very hard to get saturated fat. That's the fat that's solid at room temperature. It's very hard to get saturated fat in most environments. They tend to be full of micronutrients, and they tend to be highly fibrous, i.e. non-processed. And pretty much all the really healthy diets on the planet, whether you're eating a traditional Japanese diet or a Mediterranean diet or a traditional Indian diet, you know, all of these are healthy diets. It's easier to say what's unhealthy, which is the processed modern, you know, we call it the SAD diet, right? The standard American diet, right? It's full of, you know, it's Big Macs and all that other crap, right? It kills people.
What about vegetarianism or veganism even more? Is that in line with what your body is designed to be?
Well, remember, we didn't evolve to be healthy, right? We evolved to have as many offspring as possible. So you know, trying to pick your diet based on the Paleolithic is a bad idea. That's the problem with the paleo diet. Until recently, vegetarianism was impossible, right? You couldn't be a hunter-gatherer and be a vegetarian because the vegetables that we eat today are domesticated. They've had a lot of the fiber bred out of them. If any of you ever eaten wild foods, right? You know, the wild foods in Africa, I work with hunter-gatherers, and you know, the sweetest foods they have are about as sweet as a carrot, right? There's not much sugar in them, and they're filled with fiber, right? So we've bred through domestication most of the fiber out of our foods. So even our high-fiber foods are actually fiber-depleted, and we have food processing and Cuisinarts and, you know, boiling and all kinds of stuff that's not available to hunter-gatherers, so that we can get more energy from the food. So hunter-gatherers really can't survive as vegetarians. But today we can, and vegetarianism is extremely healthy. There's lots of data that show that vegetarians are actually healthier than people who eat meat. So it's a modern thing that we can do. That's good. It's good for the planet. So I'm very pro-vegetarian. So yeah, nothing wrong with it.
There are two things that you mentioned in your book, which I thought would be of interest to a large number of people. One is all of us wear shoes, and you say that it has its cause. And similarly about the kind of food that we give our infants or children and how that affects it. So just these questions.
So he asked, the question he asked was basically, what about shoes and what we feed our infants in terms of its, you know, evolutionary implications? Well, what I would say is, you know, I think sometimes we try so hard to label things as good and bad. I mean, some things are bad. You know, anything you eat in McDonald's is probably bad for you, right? So that's easy. But pretty much things have trade-offs, right? There are costs and benefits, and they're complicated. Like shoes, for example, are comfortable, and they can look good, and they protect your feet. But they also can decrease the amount of work that your foot muscles have to do. And we know that people who are barefoot almost never have flat feet, for example. and they run differently often. So they have very cushioned heels, they crash into the ground, and we think that causes a lot of running injuries. So I think we need to think in a kind of a more trade-off perspective in terms of how these costs and benefits interact with the biology that we inherited. And the same is true of foods. I mean, we're never going to feed our children the foods that children in the Paleolithic ate, but that's fine. I mean, children in the Paleolithic had a 30 to 40% infant mortality rate. I think we've made some progress, so that's okay.
So I'm opening it up for the audience for questions. Please.
Hello. Good morning, sir. So you talked about being pro-vegetarian, but last year I visited Iceland and I got, over there, fruits and vegetables are hardly available and people actually live on meat and they have one of the longest lifespans. So what do you think that is because of? Is that a cultural reason or something else?
I think I heard you correctly, that you were in Iceland and fruits and vegetables. So yes, that's absolutely true. So there's no question humans evolved in tropical environments where fruits and vegetables were dominant. But when you go to an Arctic environment, I actually traveled with some Inuit hunters in Greenland a few years ago. And boy, talk about a hard place to get vegetables. You know where they get their vegetables in the winter from? They eat the intestinal contents of reindeer. That's the only vegetables that they're able to get, which is not very palatable, I can tell you. But that's how you survive, right? And we know there's been some selection in those environments to help them handle saturated fats, which, by the way, the rest of us don't have. But remember, we didn't evolve to be healthy. We evolved to survive and reproduce, and they have a high burden of heart disease. And until recently, you had no choice what you could eat there. Now you can fly in vegetables in the middle of the winter, but it's still a challenge. But again, we have to dissociate, this idea that what we evolved to eat is what necessarily best for us. We evolved to eat a diversity of things, and just to get as much as we can out of them so we can survive. That's an important lesson. We did not evolve to be healthy.
So Dr. Jordan Metzel's checking in on you and is seeing if you're doing your burpees. That's the first thing. The second thing is, have you done a full marathon barefoot, and how has that worked for you? And do you think metformin is something that's actually going to affect aging?
Oy. Wow, 3 questions. Okay. Yes, I am doing my exercises. Thank you, Jordan. Jordan is a doctor in New York City who really promotes physical activity. I have never run a marathon barefoot. I've run marathons in minimal shoes. I think the longest I've run barefoot is a half marathon. But I don't run barefoot. I started running barefoot because I was studying it and I thought I'd try it. But I discovered it's actually kind of fun. And a lot of people are sort of terrified and think it's so weird. I think it's interesting that we're so out of touch with our bodies that people think that there's something weird or abnormal or dangerous about running barefoot. And I think it's very much indicative of just how much we don't understand how our bodies work. I mean, for millions of years, everybody was barefoot, and shoes are very recent. As an example, I was running in Cambridge, Massachusetts not a few years ago, and I was running by this woman who was walking her dogs, and she said to me, "Oh, you're barefoot." And as I was running by, without thinking, I said, "Your dogs are barefoot." And she... and the look of... I didn't think it just came out of my brain. And the look of shock on her face... but it's not the big deal running barefoot. You just need some calluses, and all of us can develop calluses. And the third question was metformin. Metformin is an interesting question, because metformin for those of you who don't know, metformin is a medicine that's given to people with type 2 diabetes, but it seems to have interesting metabolic consequences that may be very beneficial. But it's complicated. I don't know what all the trade-offs are with metformin. I don't know what all the side effects are. Metformin, I know that when you give to young people, they quickly develop an intolerance to it. So I think the jury's out on metformin. And I think if we rely, I'm not anti-medicine. There are plenty of wonderful medicines to give people. But I think if we rely on treating diseases rather than preventing them, we're in trouble, right? Like, for example, cancer, right? Cancer is one of those diseases that does come more commonly with aging. In some cases, cancer is caused by aging. And we spend a lot of energy fighting cancer, and if I ever get cancer, I'm going to want to fight it too. But we don't spend much effort trying to prevent cancer. We don't even talk about it often. The average woman who exercises 150 minutes a week. So we're talking 5 times a week for 30 minutes a day, according to different estimates, and there's not one number, but you can lower your lifetime risk of breast cancer between 30 and 50% by 150 minutes of exercise a week. Now, how many of you have been told that by your doctor? Okay, 2 people, right? Most doctors don't even know that. I mean, that's shocking, right? We should be preventing diseases as much as we should be treating diseases. I'm not saying we shouldn't treat disease, but we should also prevent them. I'll let free for all here.
Yeah, I read somewhere that the human brain has grown to its maximum capacity in terms of size. So now the next evolution would be in terms of function. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, actually, our brains have gotten smaller. So in the Ice Age, people had bigger brains than today. Neanderthals had bigger brains than most of the people in this room. Our early modern human ancestors had bigger brains. And the reason our brains have gotten smaller is actually our bodies have gotten smaller. So brains and bodies scale. And as the Ice Age ended, our bodies got smaller. As for functional changes in the brain, there's no evidence that any of that's going on. I mean, I think we have some excess capacity. And really, natural selection is only going to cause change in brain size and brain function if they're heritable variations that improve reproductive success. And I don't know, most of the smart people I know aren't really winning in the reproductive success game. So I'm not sure there's really evidence that that's happening. So all those images of aliens in the future with giant, humans in the future that look like aliens with giant brains and being able to know French before they're born. That's science fiction, and let's hope it remains that way.
At the back. Hello, doctor. Hello, doctor.
Hi. I'm very impressed with your lecture, absolutely. But I have a question. You see, I'm an old associate of Dr. Trehan. He's one of India's very leading cardiac surgeon. And during one of my visits to his institute in Delhi, he said to me that we Indians are born with the smallest coronary arteries, and there's nothing you can change it. He has done thousands of coronary artery bypass surgeries in this country.
I'm sorry, can you speak more slowly? I don't understand what you're saying.
Dr. Trehan, he has made a remark based on his massive experience of doing coronary bypass surgeries in Indian patients, that Indians have very small coronary arteries. I'm just trying to say here is a very important remark. It's about genes. There is nothing which lifestyle can change. Am I right?
Well, first of all, we have evidence from populations all over the planet on coronary heart disease and hypertension. And the evidence is uncontrovertible. Until recently, people did not get coronary heart disease. The populations that we work in many populations around the world, we're talking in Asia, we're talking Africa, we're talking South America, people who are 80 years old have the same blood pressure as people who are 20 years old. And when you look at their coronary, there was a recent paper in The Lancet, for example, which I should think you should take a look at, or your doctor friend should take a look at, which showed that this Chimani population, for example, in South America, where they CT scanned a large sample of people's hearts, not a single bit of calcification in anybody's coronary arteries. The reason coronary arteries are narrow and thin, and it's true in everybody, is that until recently, coronary heart disease didn't exist, so there was never any selection to increase the size of those arteries. As we've changed our environments, we've now created conditions in which we now develop plaques in our arteries and get this disease. But it is the quintessential mismatched disease that did not used to occur. So heart disease is actually, to me, maybe the most prime example of a disease that's much, much, much more preventable than we consider it to be.
Hello, doctor.
I have a question here. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Hello, doctor. Doctor, my question was that what are the causes of diseases like Flatfoot or cancer? Do they have anything to do with genes, and is there any cure for them?
Well, of course they have something to do with genes. I mean, every disease, every aspect of your body is the product of a gene-environment interaction. Everything. I'm not saying that genes don't matter. They do matter. And some of us are more likely to get certain diseases because of our genetic background. And I'm certainly not opposed to genetic research or anything like that. Obviously, that would be ridiculous. What I'm saying is that we already have a lot of information now about the gene-environment interactions, and it's much easier. We already have the technology to modify our environments. So what are we waiting for, right? Let's promote healthy lifestyles, because we can affect one half of the equation. The other thing is that most of the genes that we know of that have effects on these diseases and phenotypes are rare genes of small effect. So for example, the genes that might make you more likely to get diabetes are not going to be the same as the genes that will make me more likely to get diabetes. And the genes that we have, each of them have very small effects, 1 or 2 percentage points in terms of risk factors. So there's no obvious genetic target for those diseases. Of course, there are molecular pathways that we can target, but when we target them with pharmaceuticals, there's always side effects, right? So again, we should treat people who have disease. We should continue to do research on the genetic basis of disease, but we should not lose sight of the fact while we do that we should also be spending more effort and more energy on environment. For example, a good friend of mine at Harvard works on diabetes, on type 1 diabetes. And we had lunch together not too long ago, and we tried to calculate using the web at lunch how much more money is available for research on the genetic basis for diabetes than on how to prevent diabetes. And it was like several orders of magnitude difference. And if you think about it, that's just nonsensical, right? Because we already know how to help people not get diabetes, right? And we're spending way more money on hopefully finding some drugs that will treat it. But we don't know if that's going to work. I'm not saying we should stop spending money on the pharmaceuticals, but we should add more money to the other pile.
Can we hear the question from?
Yeah, I have a question here.
Professor Venki Ramakrishnan? Yeah.
I was wondering if you could comment on the dip in going from the paleo period to the agricultural period, because pre-industrialization, agriculture was also quite labor intensive and not necessarily sedentary. And it had the advantage that you would have enough calories and nutrition compared to being a hunter-gatherer.
Yeah.
So I'm surprised that the life expectancy actually dropped.
Yeah, so what happened was, great question. It's an interesting mixed bag, right? There's no simple story. But when we started farming, there were good things, right? Farmers got more energy, so they could increase their reproductive rate. Farmers, so there was basically more calories. It gave us more division of labor, so we could have civilization. All kinds of good things happened with farming, right? But and people were able to have more babies, which is what people really want, right? Whether they know they want it or not, that's what natural selection makes us want. But with farming also came increases in population density. So we now start living in villages. We cease to become mobile, so we now living basically in our filth, right? With poor sanitation until very recently. We start living with animals, so we start getting all kinds of diseases from animals. We decrease our nutrient diversity, so we tend to get more calories, but we get fewer vitamins and various other sorts of things. And so the end result was that once farming occurred, we had an increase in infectious disease, smallpox, polio, all the big diseases that we care about. A lot of them malaria became more common because we started having irrigation and mosquitoes could breed more. So there was a vast increase in infectious disease, but also farmers had to work pretty hard. So they had high physical levels of physical activity. And it really wasn't until the Industrial Revolution with sanitation and medicine that we began to conquer a lot of those infectious diseases. And so, and which take up a lot of energy. So if you look at infant mortality, so infant mortality among farmers and hunter-gatherers is about the same. And it's really not until sanitation and medicine that infant mortality declines. If you look at longevity, the average hunter-gatherer who survives childhood, I think the modal age of death is 68 to 78 among hunter-gatherer populations, about 12 populations. With farming, that plummeted. So, if you're a farmer in most of the agricultural era, you were lucky to live to you were 40. And then it's come back up again to hunter-gatherer levels or slightly higher. And in terms of height, which is a really good measure of overall health, hunter-gatherers are pretty tall, depending on where they live and what part of the world. Height decreased rapidly during the early farmers. So early farmers are much shorter than hunter-gatherers because of all the nutritional insults they have from disease and et cetera. And then height has gone back up again, and now we're slightly taller than hunter-gatherers. So it's been a kind of a mixed bag. But for the most part, farming was really bad for our health. Great for our reproductive success, but really bad for our health.
I have a question here. Hi. I'm right here. Yeah.
Yes.
So I think your slide spoke a little bit about Western medicine treating the symptom and not the cause, right?
Yes.
So there are a lot of non-pseudoscience kind of treatments like chi energy and all of that, which talk about treating the root cause and not the symptom, right? Things like Reiki and all of that. Do you believe that's really an effective way, like acupressure or acupuncture or something, things like that, which say they unblock the energy systems and kind of treat the root cause and not the symptom? Do you think that is something which is really effective, or is it just humbug in pseudoscience?
Well, that's a pretty big question. Pseudoscience is an interesting word because if you don't like somebody's ideas, you call it pseudoscience. And I'm hesitant to call every non-traditional form of medicine pseudoscience. Some of it does have some important basis. I'm not also saying that we shouldn't treat symptoms. I'm just saying we can't just focus on symptoms. So sometimes symptomatic relief is an important form of treatment, and also there's so much suffering in the world, we should help alleviate suffering. So I'm not opposed to treating symptoms. It's just that if you focus only on treating symptoms, you're just going to have more of them occur. So I'll give you an example. I mean, for example, myopia, right? Myopia is caused by spending a lot of time indoors, being in school. If we really cared deeply about myopia, right, we would ban children from being in school. I think most of us would agree that it's, I'm willing to put up with putting my kids in glasses in order, for the benefit for them, even if it is a mismatched disease. So let's go ahead, let's keep treating the symptoms of myopia, right? We may find there's actually an interesting pathway, BMP4, that's important in myopia, and we maybe find a way to treat it in a molecular fashion, actually. Or cavities, right? I mean, we can't suddenly stop feeding people carbohydrates and get rid of cavities. The world would starve, right? So dentists and podiatrists and ophthalmologists are safe, right? And maybe there are other forms of treatment as well that you mentioned that also have benefits. There's actually a lot of not enough good science to evaluate them, and I don't want to treat them with one brush.
Hello, sir. Excuse me. Here. I love running myself, and whenever I see your quotes in the newspaper, in any running related article or from your research paper, and you coming to JLF was like, it was very important for me to attend this session. My question is, how did running or you taking up running help you understand your own body better, and also your own research while you were mentioning related to biomechanics and all that? So can you please share more about that experience?
Sure, thank you. Well, so I was always a runner. I actually started running when I was a kid because my mother was a professor at a university where they built a fancy new gym, and they didn't let women use the gym. And my mother was so mad that she started running to liberate the gym. And I was a kid, and I didn't realize what a hero my mother was, but you do what your parents do, and I started running. And I was never really very serious. But I enjoyed running, and I kind of figured out it was sort of helped me. I was hyperactive. You probably figured out I'm hyperactive. So I was kind of a hyperactive kid, and I realized it helped calm me down. And so I kind of kept running throughout college, but I wasn't really a very serious runner. And then when we started studying running, it was really to study the problem of how we keep our heads still when we run, that I started getting more interested in the evolution of running. And it turned into an interesting kind of feedback loop because I'm a kind of a participant observation person. I like to try what I study. That's why I started trying barefoot running. And so the more I studied running, the more I got interested in my own running. And then, of course, the more I got interested in my own running, the more it kind of helped fuel my academic interest. And I found that the two became a kind of a positive feedback loop. And I'll tell you a funny story. So I remember once running one morning in Cambridge. It was early on in my running career. And we were doing these experiments, and we were interested in how arms affect the head. It turns out your arm is connected to your head in an interesting neuromuscular fashion. And so I was running around, and I was trying to think of an experiment we wanted to do where we'd like try to get people's arms out of the equation. And I think I was like running with my arms above my head in some park early morning in Cambridge, and this guy was walking his kid to school, and I heard him say very loudly to his kid, "That guy doesn't know how to run." And he was like, right, yeah, I probably looked really stupid. But I have to say, it's been really a wonderful adventure for me, because the first time I ran a marathon, it was because I was invited to give a lecture, actually, at a marathon. And I thought, I should try this. And I became hooked. And so for me, the studying it and doing it have become intrinsically linked. And in fact, in my lab, we do a lot of research now on injury. I can say very selfishly that one of the reasons I'm interested in studying injury, apart from it being academically interesting and important, is that personally, I don't want to be injured, right? So I have a selfish motivation not only to study injury, but also to get it right, because I don't want to screw myself up either. So I think there's something, that's one of the things I'm very lucky about in my field, is that I get to study, I didn't pick it this way, but by studying the human body, I mean, we all have bodies, and we can all experience our bodies and think about our bodies and try different diets. I once, for example, also, I was writing about raw foodism, people who don't cook their food, and I thought, well, I'll try that out. So I actually spent a few days trying to be a raw foodist, which was the most horrible experience of my life. I don't recommend it. If you want to lose weight, go ahead. But I spent all my life, my several days, all I was thinking about was, oh, I can't eat the cracker. I can't have sushi. I can't, what am I going to do? And I was like spending ridiculous amounts of time in the kitchen trying to do this. So it's kind of fun to experiment on your body, if you do it safely, that is. But so I think there's a feedback, and I think that's part of the fun of science. And I think we often think of scientists as, people in white lab coats sort of, doing boring stuff. But even if you're working at the molecular level, it has relevance to your body, and you can get involved in thinking about how that affects you. A lot of the stereotypes about science, I think, are wrong.
So you had mentioned.
Yeah, please. Can't see that because the light can't see the hands that are going up there.
What changes in lifestyle would you recommend for improving the quantity and the quality of one's sleep?
Oh, I mean, I think everybody in this room knows it. It's pretty easy, Don't eat too much processed food. Get some exercise. Don't get too stressed. Hot milk? If it works for you, go ahead. Not everybody can digest milk. But yeah, I mean, eat a healthy diet, get some exercise, and you get too stressed. It's not very hard. I mean, everybody knows that. And do what you find enjoyable, right? If you like to run, run. If you like to swim, swim. If you like to walk, walk. There are better and worse ways to do all these things, and there are better and worse foods. But everything has trade-offs. So the hard question is not what to do, right? And don't smoke, right? The hard question is not what to do. The hard question is how to get people to do it and how to help each other do it. That's the hard question.
Excuse me. So, you had mentioned that humans are meant to reproduce and survive. And today we are not living for reproduction. Rather, we are living to just make a living out of our lives and to live and to experience. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, we've had the repercussions of living the way we are living. We've had the repercussions of technology as well.
So that's an interesting question. There's no value judgment attached to natural selection, obviously. I mean, selection is still operating on our reproductive behaviors regardless of whether we intend them or not. So selection is not about intentionality. So when I said we evolved to reproduce, have as many offspring as possible who survive to reproduce, I didn't mean that in the intentional sense of the word. That's just simply the outcome that gets affected by natural selection. So I'm sure our Paleolithic ancestors also cared about things other than reproduction. They cared about friendship and marriage and beauty and all the things that we care about too, but natural selection wasn't acting on that. So our goals have changed with the modern world. I mean, nobody in the Paleolithic had to worry about a lawyer, right? Nobody in the Paleolithic had to worry about, sending their kid to college or whatever. But they did worry about their children, and they did worry about their interactions in the group. And so that hasn't changed. We're still the same biologically.
Sir, you're from Harvard and US. And we are made to believe that US spends the maximum money on research and development. So every time you pop in a pill, a medicine, which is considered very good, and suddenly it gets banned. Do you think even the food industry is controlled by the industrialist, or the pharmaceuticals are controlled? And how much should we believe in your research? Because once we were told that fats is not good, because if you eat fat, the ghee and butter, it goes and makes a fatty liver. But now, the ghee and butter has become very good. Proteins are very good, but now we should eat them in moderation. Carbs are good, they give you energy, but now carbs are really bad. Sugar spikes up your insulin, so don't have sugar. Fruits were considered very, very good, and now they say it's got a lot of sugar, so don't eat fruits. What is it that we need to learn?
Great question. So I love your question. So I teach a course, an upper level course called Diet and Exercise. And the purpose of the course is to get students to read the primary literature to realize exactly what you're saying, which is that we haven't got all these answers yet. We don't. And part of the reason is that we have a very nutrient, ingredient-based focus, which you just kind of channeled in your question, right? We talk about sugar, we talk about vitamin K, we talk about this. We don't often talk about food, right? And remember, as I said earlier, everything has trade-offs. There are costs and benefits to everything. There are benefits to saturated fat, and there are costs to saturated fat. There are benefits to sugar, and there are costs to sugar. And I think that the basic framework that we use to evaluate diet is broken. And that's why you get this yo-yo effect. And that's because we're not using our evolutionary thinking to evaluate diet in a sensible way. So everything has trade-offs, and we have a lot to learn about the relative costs and benefits of saturated fat, et cetera. So, and remember, we didn't evolve to be healthy. So there is no simple story, and anybody who tells you that is wrong. That's why when I answered that question earlier, I answered it in a very, very careful way, which is like, we know, basically, unprocessed diets are generally healthy. Now, should you eat a little bit more of this or a little bit more of that? That's a big debate that's going on, and it probably differs for you and then for me, or for somebody who grew up in one environment, for somebody who grew up in another environment, or has different genetic background. We're trying to oversimplify a complicated story, and I'm sorry, there is no simple answer. I ain't going to give it to you.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
I recently stumbled upon an article which said biologists like Waddington, Pigliucci, and Mueller strongly criticized the statement that evolutionary biology needs urgent reforms. What are your views on that?
Evolutionary biology needs urgent reforms? I have no idea what you're talking about. I mean, people say all kinds of things, but why do you need to reform? First of all, science isn't a thing. Evolutionary biology isn't a thing. It's a process. It's an ongoing process. So that sounds like conspiracy theory kind of stuff, right? Science. One of the beauties of science is it's a self-reforming process, right? And if you're wrong, believe me, there are a lot of people out there trying to figure out why you're wrong, right? It's a self-correcting process. So it's not like there's an evolutionary biology cabal out there that sort of decided what evolutionary biology is and it just sticks that way. It's a constantly dynamic field in which people are constantly questioning. I mean, everything I said today, there are people, I guarantee you, there are people out there trying to find how I'm wrong. And that's right and proper. They should be doing that, just as I'm trying to do that for them. So there is no evolutionary biology that needs reform. It's an ongoing self-correcting process.
Hi, quick question. I'm going to go back onto the food and evolution concept, and I just wanted to bring your attention on milk and ask you if there's an evolutionary thought about milk in particular. We as a country are obsessed with the idea of milk, And I believe, I'm a physician myself, and it's very insulinogenic, and the cows have to be pumped with hormones all the time and antibiotics, etc. So I wanted to know your thoughts on milk as food.
Lovely question. So there's two kinds of milk, right? There's mother's milk, and then there's the milk we get after we're weaned, right? I presume you're talking more about the second milk, right? Yeah. So mother's milk is very good. That's very little debate about that. Very important. Breastfeeding is very important. But milk is another one of those cost-benefit things, right? Milk is very energy rich. I mean, that's what it evolved for. It's a high protein, high fat, food for growing mammals, right? And that's why we and other mammals produce it, and that's why it's so useful for promoting growth. But like everything else, milk comes with trade-offs, and we evolved to. Certain populations in the world evolved the ability to ingest milk after weaning. Only a few populations in the world, just in the last few thousand years. And again, the trade-offs are complicated, right? And they also depend upon in terms of the other context. So if you're worried about nutrition and you're nutritionally stressed, milk has benefits. But as you say, milk is also a high sugar food, which can also have complications. I mean, there's just no simple answer. Remember, what we evolved to do is to get as much energy as possible in order to have more babies who can then have more babies. I mean, that's why we're here, right? It's energy in, babies out. That's the equation, right? And milk is a form of energy. And so we're stuck with, there's no simple answer.
One very quick question, Doctor. In the context of healthy living, as individuals, how can we deal with the rising pollution levels? Thank you.
Oy, I'm an evolutionary biologist. I don't know how to solve that one. I mean, that's a political problem. I'm sorry, I don't know how to answer that other than let's ban cars and prevent people from getting on airplanes. And I mean, these are serious issues. I mean, obviously it's going to require regulation. We need governments to solve that problem. I'm sorry, I'm an evolutionary biologist who works on bodies. I don't know how to answer that question with authority, but thank you.
We have run out of time, otherwise this could have gone on for far longer. Thank you everyone for a wonderful session, and thank you, Dan.
We wish to thank Daniel E. Lieberman, Tony Joseph, and the next session begins at 12:30.